Hello, something guys and gals. This is Something Guy 912. Despite how much I fashion myself as the guy who'll do anything and everything as long as it's something, I've noticed as of late a lot of my small topics are more or less video game related. So why not continue that trend with yet another video game topic, and one that feels as old as the concept of video games themselves? That they are, or at least should be, treated to the same degree as art does in terms of its appreciation, even if said art these days is an acquired taste. Now, normally, whenever a discussion on the nature of whether video games are art, people seem to oscillate to two sides of the extreme. One will claim no video game is art, and that the people who'd claim it are pseudo intellectual fart sniffers who only take enjoyment out of the idea of games being a interactive novel. And the people on the other side will claim all video games are art, regardless of how technically absent the gameplay mechanics of a given video game are. Obviously, I've positioned myself on the idea that video games in of itself aren't art, so I'm just going to first state that if you find artistic merit in the making of video games, great, I'm not your enemy. My basis for making this video is first to trying to understand what is art, what is a video game, and whether their definitions coincide with one another, and to summarize, I don't think they do. To start, art as a whole is a immutable subject. Any painting, photograph, or sculpture, the moment it has finished its creation, is final. What do I mean by this? Let's use a very easy example of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. That piece of art will remain as it is because the artist is satisfied with the version of the Mona Lisa seen before you. No matter what medium it is presented, no matter what political slacktivist's vain attempt to deface it will do, it will always be the same. This cannot be said for a video game. Video games fundamentally are a interactive medium, in which the player will do as they see fit, often outside of the creator's intentions or visions, and that variability to put a word whitely, pervert the intentions of what the game designer or developer had is inexorable to my claim that video games cannot be touted as art. Think of it this way. Imagine we go back to when Da Vinci was working on the Mona Lisa, and you had the power to influence a particular stroke of the brush, or what the background would look like. That is, in essence, the same as playing a video game. Any slight deviation from the creator's intent, no matter how subtle, is no longer that creator's intention. It becomes yours. But even by the nature of how you shape the world is not foundational in making the video game itself art, but that you are making art in a video game. Going back to the nature of art's immutability, video games are also not as immutable as they seem. Every video game is inherently flawed in its code, and as a result will tend to break the cleverly crafted illusion of its world. Or to make an even simpler example, the many times that video games upon release will come with huge patches to fix gaping bugs in its system, something that art in its faults simply has to abide by. Sure, some video games eventually will tire out of any updates or fixes, but that isn't as a result of the game becoming flawless, more so with developers packing up and leaving town. If we are to take this absolute approach that video games are art, then by that very nature they wouldn't be tampered with in the first place, and left to remain as bug-riddled and low of content upon release. Speaking of content, that is another curious oddity about video games that contrives from them being art. No piece of art has ever had extra content taped on top of what was originally commissioned, or released to increase its longevity as such. Of course, not to say that this is a bad thing, but the fact that art hasn't, yet video games do, does start to dispel the notion for me that they can be classified as such. I think this adherence to video games being only a visual medium really came at a head when the video game Scorn came out a few months ago. It's a visual spectacle aping the dire, derelict, flesh violently mixed with machine aesthetic of H.R. Geiger, yet as something to be played it leaves a lot to be desired, with the most rudimentary of combat and puzzles with nary any lore or dialogue to weave this interesting world together. In fact, games being an interactive medium is part of why any world building matters. We want to engross ourselves into a world that has feedback to how we interact with it. I highly doubt Bioshock, one of my favorite games as you know, would really carry itself the influence it had or the art style it carried if it played more like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Ironic, considering the name of Bioshock's decrepit underwater city is Rapture. When we interact with modern or classical art, we do so passively. We inspect the piece and try to weave meaning from it. Whereas video games are interacted with actively, as the designers weave meaning from that game for us. Games like Dear Esther or Firewatch don't have as much staying power as, say, Half-Life or Gears of War, not only because the former lack any player feedback, but that the former relies on its visual spectacle to compensate for how lackluster playing it is. Walking simulator is a term often derisive of such titles like this, and I think games like these exist under a fundamental failing that a style can be easily translated. Movies can get away with being called art because of the way they are created and how the audience interacts with the medium. Passive, which is why a lot of art movies exist and aren't nearly as lambasted as the concept of art games. But none of this is an attempt to diminish or downplay the efforts the game designers put into making the world come to life. As I mentioned, Bioshock's underwater technological marvel coalesce into a horror noir shooter is a timeless treasure to behold, and often wipes the floor of newer games in their attempts at an art style. But if in that same game space I can take several splicer corpses and make a giant penis or a swastika out of them, I think at that point I've massively deviated from the artistic direction the designers intended. Did I make art from such a creation? Sure, but the same could be said about a sandbox. The sandbox is not the art, it's what you make in said sandbox that becomes art. Legos aren't artistic marvels because of merely having the pieces, but what you make out of them. And the same could be said of the very sandbox style of games like Minecraft that facilitate your creativity, but in of themselves are not creations of their own. At the end of this whole making comparison, what's the point of doing so? It's not like future game developers will find this video and awe at its wisdom, or that people will suddenly turn on a dime after hearing my philosophy on the subject. I suppose my reasons for making it is that I've never liked the people who argue that video games are art in a subjective and, frankly, aggressive manner, because art, by its very nature, is subjective in how we value it, so doing that is circular and just talks around the real reasons why people like I don't see them as art. To simply put, it's hard to watch a movie and pretend you are influencing its narrative like a game, and it's equally as hard to only watch a game and pretend you are influencing it. Well, this is likely going to be the last video that I'll make on this channel for the year, as next year I'll be hard at work with the Wonderlands as a story script, as I had alluded to several months back, and seeing as that new Tales from the Borderlands game graced our laps in the same year, I got even more narrative drivel for me to comb over for the coming time. Hope the rest of this year fares well for you.